Hello and welcome to Jenna Rereads The Silmarillion, Episode 8, Fëanor's Got Issues. Okay, so this is actually my third attempt at recording this. Yeah, seriously, that's why it's taken so long. The other ones, well, I kind of got a little off track as I was, attempting to record this before and went on rambling about Fëanor in no particular direction, and it wasn't exactly coherent, so I decided I would just try to record it again and hope that it will be more coherent this time. As you probably guessed, Fëanor is one of my favorite characters in here, and I got a lot to say about him. So, before we get started, a recap of the last episode, since it's been a while, in case you forgot. Basically, what happened was the elves finally got to Valinor. Although, with the Teleri, it took a little bit of doing to actually get them there, because, like usual, they were dithering and kind of missed the first trip over, so they had to go back, but they eventually made it. So, everybody's in Valinor, living happily. And we also went through the family tree of the House of Finwë. Now, that information is going to become important here. We were sort of, introduced to Fëanor last time. Not really. I mean, we just kind of found out who he was, but now we're actually going to properly meet him in this chapter, which is called Of Fëanor and the Unchaining of Melkor. Okay, so if you'll remember from the House of Finwë family tree, Finwë, the High King of the Noldor, was married to a woman called Míriel. So, they're happily married, everything's going great in Valinor, oh, isn't this wonderful? And they have a son, who is Fëanor, or Cúrú Finwë Fëanaro, if you want his proper name. I'm going to go off on a small tangent here, but I think it's kind of interesting and also relevant. All elves, or at least all of the Noldor, have two names, a father name and a mother name. The father name, which you could probably figure out from the description, is given by the father, and it usually has, like, in the case of a son, it'll have part of the father's name in it, and for a daughter, it'll have part of the mother's name. Basically, it's sort of, it functions a little bit like a surname, sort of, in that it kind of, indicates things like, you know, the family that you belong to. And so Fëanor's father name is Cúrú Finwë, which basically just means skilled Finwë. And we'll find out how that relates to him shortly. And now, the mother name is a name that's given by the mother. And this name is usually a bit more personal in that it has, it's either a name of insight or foresight. You know, mothers, among the elves tend to have either glimpses of insight or foresight about their children. So the mother name may reference a particular characteristic that the child has, for example. And Fëanor's is Fëanaro. Why we call him Fëanor? Well, that'll be sort of explained a lot later. We'll just suffice it to say that this is a very brief summary of this whole thing, that there's two main elven languages, Quenya and Sindarin, and Fëanor is kind of a Cinderized version of Fëanaro, which is his Quenya name. But anyway, so now, unfortunately, after Fëanor is born, there's a bit of a problem. His mother, Míriel, is completely exhausted by the act of giving birth to him. Completely exhausted, both physically and spiritually. Now, I gotta explain something here. A lot of this information, like the information that I just gave you about elven names, is not in the Silmarillion. It's actually in the History of Middle-earth books, particularly History of Middle-earth Volume 10, Morgoth's Ring. There's an essay in there called Laws and Customs of the Eldar that talks about a lot of this stuff. And one of the things that it talks about is elvish pregnancy and how it works. With elves, both it's a drain on both the father and the mother having children. But more so on the mother, because obviously the mother's the one that's got to be pregnant, and elvish pregnancy lasts a year. That basically Fëanor's mother is completely exhausted by giving birth to him, that she's basically suffering kind of an extreme version of this. It's kind of the reason why, like, elves don't have lots and lots of children. Because you think they're immortal, they got all the time in the world, right? And they don't seem to, there's no, like, elvish menopause, so they could theoretically have children throughout their whole immortal lives, but it's an actual drain on them. You know, a physical and spiritual drain. And, you know, basically an extreme version of this is what's just happened to Míriel. So she names Fëanor Fëanaro, which means spirit of fire, which will turn out to be a very appropriate name, as we will see. So Míriel basically tells Finwë that she's so completely exhausted from bearing and giving birth to Fëanor that she wants to die. I said, this is something that's very kind of strange, because we don't really see any other example of this, and it's not natural for elves. One thing is, elves, their bodies and their spirits, it's their nature to want to be together. So if they do die and their spirits are hanging out in the halls of Mondos, it's natural for them to long for their bodies and want to be re-embodied. But, you know, Míriel deliberately wants to die. And, you know, she tells Finwë that she's never going to be able to have another child. She says, "For strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor." And Finwë's all upset by this, because he's like, I wanted to have more kids! And then he's like, well, you know, we are in paradise here. It's the land of the Valar. Surely you can be healed somehow. But time goes by, and she's not recovering. So, you know, Finwë goes to Manwë and is like, what should we do? And he's like, hey, we'll send her to Lorien. Remember him? He's the Vala of dreams and drugs, and his wife is the Vala of healing. So that's a good place to go if you want to be healed. So she goes there, but instead of healing, she lies down to sleep and dies. Yeah, she really wants to die. Now, I'm going to go in a little digression here again. I've seen on Tumblr some people kind of interpret what's wrong with Míriel here as being a kind of metaphor for postpartum depression, which, to be quite honest, is an explanation I can't quite get behind it, I guess. I feel like, you know, given the information that we have about elvish pregnancy that I just shared with you, that this is something that they can experience. This sort of weariness is something that can happen, and that it's not just, you know, human depression, I guess. That this is an elvish thing, and that it's not necessarily supposed to be a stand-in for, you know, a human problem. So, anyway, so her spirit goes to the halls of Mondos. And the maidens of Este keep tending her body, and they sort of creepily make it look just like it did when she was alive. And then Finwë, of course, is deeply grieved by this. And he keeps visiting her body and like talking to her and hoping that she'll somehow wake up. But it doesn't work. And here we get this line. Alone in all the blessed realm, he was deprived of joy. After a while, he went to Lorien no more. All his love he gave thereafter to his son. Yeah. So, Finwë is left alone with a young child to take care of. And Fëanor is, well, we'll put it this way. He's a bit of a precocious child. Basically, it's like, he's like, a genius child, basically. But, however, Finwë is still not entirely happy. He's lonely, okay? Well, actually, you know what? Finwë is basically hard up at this point. He wants to have more kids, and so, okay. Actually, before we go any further, I should just say, I'm going to give you a lot of information here that's actually not in the Silmarillion. It's in the History of Middle-earth books. There's a much, longer and more detailed version of this story in the History of Middle-earth. So I'm going to share some of that with you. I just thought I would say that so that anybody doesn't get really confused. So, yeah, Finwë's hard up, and he happens to meet Indis, who is the niece of the High King Ingwe of the Vanyar, and for some reason, High King of all the elves. And Indis has had a thing for Finwë for a while, but she never thought she'd have a chance with him because he was happily married to Míriel. Well, now, Míriel's out of the picture, Finwë's available, and they, meet each other at this party, and Finwë realizes that he sort of returns her feelings. So he goes to the Valar and is like, I want to get married again. But there's a problem, because this is something that has never, ever, ever been done. No elf has ever had two spouses. Ever. At least, not that we know of. I mean, who knows what the Avari are doing in Middle-earth. But, see, with elves, because, if they die, they can always be re-embodied. Death isn't considered the end of a marriage. So Míriel's in the halls of Mondos, and she could theoretically be re-embodied. So no elf is allowed to have two spouses. There's no polygamy going on here. So the Valar have this big debate about what they're going to do here. So they end up coming to the conclusion that, all right, you can marry again, but Míriel has to agree to stay in the halls of Mondos and never be re-embodied ever. So Míriel agrees to this and is totally cool with Finwë remarrying, actually. And so Finwë marries Indis of the Vanyar. But there's one person who is really not happy about this turn of events, and that's Fëanor. Yes, in a somewhat different twist on the traditional wicked stepmother story, we've actually got a kind stepmother and a sort of quote-unquote wicked stepson. I think this is something that's maybe a little difficult for people to relate to sometimes. Fëanor's feelings about his father's second marriage, but we have to keep in mind the context. He's, by marrying again, has condemned his mother, has condemned Fëanor's mother to be in the halls of Mondos forever. And although Míriel agreed to this, from Fëanor's perspective, it doesn't really look very good. It looks like he's basically just trying to replace Míriel. Now, I can't imagine it was very easy for him growing up, knowing that he was, kind of, in some way, responsible for his mother's death. And all he's got is his father. And now his father wants to get remarried. He's going to have this other family. I think Fëanor felt like he was being sort of shoved aside, or that he was somehow not good enough. So he absolutely hates Indis. And he hates Indis's children, particularly her sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin. Fingolfin, Fëanor just sees as a total threat to him. Doesn't try to make friends with his half-brothers at all. Instead, what he does is, totally focus on crafts and things. Remember the Noldor that are really into things like smithcraft and making stuff, basically? Well, Fëanor is pretty much the epitome of this. Remember, I said his father name means skilled Finwë? Well, this is the kind of skill that it's referring to. He makes a new alphabet while still in his youth. He makes a more efficient alphabet than the one that the elves were currently using. This is the Tengwar, which is the one that you see on, for instance, it's the writing that's on the One Ring, that becomes, the standard Elvish alphabet afterwards. And he gets really interested in things like making jewels. And he's the first one of the Noldor to discover that you can artificially create jewels that are even more beautiful than those that come from the earth. So he learns all this fancy smithcraft from Aule, and because he wants to really get out of the house, he can't stand being in it with Indis there, he ends up taking an apprenticeship with this really great elven smith called Matan. And he learns a lot from him, but of perhaps greater interest to him while he's studying in the House of Matan is Matan's daughter, Nerdanel. Now, Nerdanel is a really great character. She doesn't do much in the narrative, but she is just a really fascinating character, in my opinion. And interestingly, she's one of the most popular female characters in this fandom. Even on par with Luthien, which is saying a lot. So, Nerdanel is the daughter of Matan. Now, typically, among the Noldor, sort of smithcraft and those kind of things are more, it's men that are into that kind of stuff. But Nerdanel is an exception. She is totally into smithcraft, and her big thing is sculpting. She loves to sculpt. She's a sculptor. And she's so good that she makes, this information on Nerdanel is from the History of Middle-earth, by the way. There's actually, much more information on her there than there is in the Silmarillion. She actually makes sculptures that are so realistic that people sometimes mistook them for real people. And there's this great line, which I'm not going to read the exact line because I don't have that particular History of Middle-earth book open right now. But there's a great line in this description of her that says that she, created other sculptures in forms of her own imagining, which to me sounds like she basically invented abstract art, which is very cool. So you can see why Fëanor is attracted to her. They're both artists and craftspeople. They're into a lot of the same things. So he and Nerdanel, while Fëanor is still fairly young, decide to get married. And this was something that took a lot of people by surprise, because Nerdanel was not supposed to have been a great looker. She was considered kind of plain, not a great beauty, really. And so everybody was kind of surprised why Fëanor would marry somebody like that. But as I said, it's more, I think, her artistic skill, it's the mind, and the shared interest that they have that attracts him. Nerdanel is also called Nerdanel the Wise sometimes, and I'm going to read the description in here. Nerdanel was also firm of will, but more patient than Fëanor, desiring to understand minds rather than to master them, and at first she restrained him when the fire of his heart grew too hot. But his later deeds grieved her, and they became estranged. 7 sons she bore to Fëanor. Her mood she bequeathed in part to some of them, but not to all. So she and Fëanor have 7 sons, which is a record for the most children among any elven couple ever. So, okay, Fëanor and Nerdanel, they must have had a really hot sex life. Really. Having all those kids, yeah, they must have. So anyway, at this point, Fëanor is just really interested in all this stuff that he's doing. He's just loving making jewels and inventing things. And if you remember from the previous chapter, Fëanor and his sons, and Nerdanel too, like to go traveling around Amon. There's actually a line in History of Middle-earth that Fëanor and Nerdanel apparently first met while they were both out exploring Amon. And so they're traveling around, they're, interested in learning basically as much as they can. See, the Noldor are also, they're really into knowledge, remember? So while all this is going on, it turns out that Melkor's terms of imprisonment in the halls of Mondos, the 3 ages that he was sent to be imprisoned in there, are now over. And so basically, he's released, and the Valar, have a meeting to decide, whether or not they should let him go. And of course, Melkor is like, "Oh, I'm so sorry about everything. If you just make me the least of the free people of Valinor, I'll help you in everything, and I'll heal all the damage I did before." And Nienna buys it, which, is keeping in character, because she's like the Vala of pity and compassion and stuff. So she's all about, giving people second chances. But most unfortunately, Manwë buys it. But Mondos is like, not a good idea. Of course, Mondos knows everything that's going to happen anyway. But to me, this is sort of like the perfect example of good is dumb. Remember back in the Valaquenta where I said that Manwë is kind of like the perfect example of a character who epitomizes good is dumb? Well, here you go. This is the perfect example of that. It's like, I would not trust Melkor as far as I could throw him, and I don't think I could throw him very far. I think the Valar made a colossal fuck-up when they let him go and bought his, "Oh, I've changed" explanation. That was a huge mistake, and we're gonna see exactly how big a mistake this was. So basically, he gets let out, but he's sort of put on a parole, basically, where he has to stay in Valmar, where the Valar can keep an eye on him, but everything he does is just totally beyond reproach, so they're like, okay, we'll let him out for good behavior. So he starts, wandering around the elves, and of course he hates the elves because they're Ilúvatar's children, and, he wants to basically destroy anything that anybody else created, remember? Of course, some of the other Valar are just not buying this either. Ulmo doesn't buy it. Tolkas doesn't buy it. It says Tolkas clenched his hands whenever he saw Melkor, his foe, go by. Tolkas wants to beat the shit out of Melkor again. But because Manwë said, we're going to let him go, all the other Valar have to stick with it. So now Melkor is plotting and plotting because he wants to, take down the elves and corrupt them, but he's not sure how. So he looks at them and he's like, the Vanyar? No, too close to the Valar. They kiss ass too much with the Valar. I'm going to be able to corrupt them. The Teleri? They're just a bunch of useless, dithering idiots who are like, oh, look at the sea! No, that's no good. But the Noldor. The Noldor are all hungry for knowledge and stuff. Yeah, I think I could work with this. I think I can work with this indeed. So Melkor specifically sets out to try to corrupt the Noldor. And this is going to be a problem, as we're going to see in the next chapter. I said he's super jealous of Fëanor, because he sees how skilled Fëanor is and how he's making all this cool stuff. And so he's going to specifically target him. He's specifically targeting the Noldor, and above all the Noldor, he's specifically targeting Fëanor. So that is not good news at all. So, that's it for the events of this chapter. I hope this was not terribly rambly. I said my first attempt at this was very rambly, so I hope I've kind of gotten rid of the rambliness. But, so I already talked about one of the big debates that this chapter brings up. It said, should the Valar have let Melkor out? But there's another one. The other one is about Finwë's remarriage. Now, the chapter actually raises the question about whether or not it was the right decision. And basically it says, you know, the children of Indis were great, also, in addition to Fëanor, and that the history of Arda would be poorer if they hadn't lived. Now, and it says, but, you know, some people thought that, you know, Finwë should have just been content with, you know, his genius son, and not remarried, because a lot of the trouble that's going to come later would have been averted. So, there, you get that, we get that in canon, but it's also a big topic for debate in the fandom. Personally, I come down on the side of Finwë's second marriage was a mistake. And this is not to any hatred to Indis or her children. It's that I like a lot of the descendants of Indis quite a bit. I like Fingon and Finrod quite a bit, for instance. I'll get into fangirling them later. So this isn't because I, like, hate all of them or anything like that. But I think it was a big mistake. And it's not because I think, oh, you know, clearly Finwë should never have been able to have sex again, or, you know, that you can't love more than one person in your lifetime. I don't believe that. But in this case, I feel like he's doing it out of fundamentally selfish reasons. He's like, oh, I want to have sex, and I want to have more kids, and, without really taking into account how it would have affected Fëanor. You know, he doesn't seem to have really considered Fëanor's feelings. The fact that Fëanor hated this so much, and it caused him so much distress, and basically made him feel kind of unwanted and displaced. I said, I feel like, you know, he should have taken that into account. How Fëanor would feel about this. How's this going to look to him? And, you know, unfortunately, he's literally the only person who this has happened to. You know, it's not like he can talk to anybody else. You know, first, it's like he must have felt that he was kind of responsible for the death of his mother, and secondly, you know, his father is now basically replacing her, which nobody else has ever done. No elf has ever had two spouses, and so it's not like he can go and talk to, say, like, other kids with divorced parents whose parents are getting remarried or anything like that. You know, there's nobody else that's in this situation. So I think a lot of these issues, with the family, these are the roots of Fëanor's issues. The way I see him is that he was constantly needing validation, to prove that he was good enough. You know, that he might have had a fear deep down that Finwë would somehow leave him or abandon him like his mother did. And now, I'm not trying to blame Míriel for abandoning Fëanor. I'm just saying that this might have been what, you know, child Fëanor might have thought. And so that's why he has to be the best. That he feels he got this insecurity. That he's afraid, basically, of losing Finwë and losing his favor. Which is, it's interesting because he pretty obviously, now we're going to get into this more in like the next chapter, the animosity between Fëanor and Fingolfin. Fëanor is always very suspicious of Fingolfin, thinking that he's like, you know, usurping Finwë's love. I think because Fëanor's really afraid of losing Finwë's love. Even though he's the favorite son, but he's just, you know, doesn't see it that way. So, you know, I feel like Finwë doesn't seem to have considered Fëanor's feelings about all of this, and how badly he would react to it. So I don't think it was really the best decision that he could have made. I really don't. So yeah, that's where I come down on this issue, that Finwë's second marriage was a mistake. No offense to Indis and her descendants. But anyway, so yeah, I hope that made sense. See, in my opinion, Fëanor is one of the greatest characters that Tolkien ever created. I mean, I would probably put him up there in, like, the greatest characters in anything I've ever read. He'd probably be somewhere in my top 10. So I can get rambly when talking about him, or a little overexcited when talking about him. So anyway, I hope this was still somewhat coherent and enjoyable for anybody who listened to it. So next time, we will see about Melkor's attempts at corrupting the Noldor and how successful they are. Until then, take care.